Okay, so thanks very much to everybody for coming here today to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. We're delighted to welcome Professor Michael Breen and Dr. Amy Healy, who will be talking about Human Trafficking and Exploitation Project, the Island of Ireland. Professor Michael Breen is the former Dean of Arts in MIC. He holds undergraduate degrees from UCD and University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, as well as a Master of Science and PhD from the Syracuse University in New York. Past research fellow of the Irish Research Council, he served as an executive member of the council and as a member of its international advisory panel. He is chair of the European Social Survey and a member of the Council of Directors of the European Values Study. He was a former director of the Irish Centre for Catholic Studies and for the Centre for Culture, Technology and Values at Mary Immaculate College. He has written extensively on human values, media and on secularism, and his most recent books being Changing Values, Attitudes and Behaviours in Ireland, an analysis of European social survey data in Ireland 2002 to 2012, with Dr. Amy Healy as well in 2016. Michael is a member of the Global Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, which was launched at a meeting in the UN in October 2018. And co-chair of its Education and Academic Subcommittee. He is co-principal investigator for the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Project in Ireland. He's also a member of the Santa Marta Group, an alliance of international police chiefs and bishops from around the world working together with civil society to eradicate modern slavery. Dr. Amy Healy is a sociologist and expert in quantitative research and holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Illinois, an MA from the University of Wisconsin, a Master's in Social Science from the University of Limerick, and a PhD from the University of Limerick also. She has lectured in sociology in the University of Limerick and is currently the acting director for doctoral programs in Mary Immaculate College Research and Graduate School. She is chair of the Sociological Association of Ireland. Amy was the postdoctoral researcher investigator with Professor Michael Breen and Professor Michael Healy in the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Project. The report on human trafficking and exploitation on the island of Ireland was launched in April 2021. We're delighted to welcome Michael and Amy here today, and I'll hand over to you both right now. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to split this presentation in two halves. I'm going to talk about trafficking in general and how the project came about, and a little bit about the Santa Marta Group. And Amy is going to talk about the project and how it was set up and what the findings were, the mechanism and methodology and the findings. The topic we're about to talk about is deeply distressing. It's dreadful. It's about the sale of human beings and the exploitation of human beings for the pleasure and profit of others. And working in this field is not easy, but the reality is that it's out there and we need to tackle it, and the more we know about it, the better we can tackle it and eradicate it from society.
Michael, you've muted yourself.
Trafficking human beings is one of the gravest criminal challenges that confronts the international community today. It's estimated that it is about $150 billion worth per annum in terms of income to traffickers, and that it is the third biggest source of criminal enterprise in terms of profit after arms and drugs. All the figures to do with trafficking are ultimately estimates. The Global Slavery Index is one estimate of the global figures, and they estimate, though it's not without question how they do it, there's about 40 million people trapped in modern slavery worldwide. 25 million of those are in forced labour of one kind or another, and 15 million in forced marriages. And when they say forced labour, they include things like domestic work, construction, agriculture, sexual exploitation, and state-imposed labour. Interestingly, most traffickers are women, and of the people who are trafficked, one in four are children, and more than 7 in 10 of them are women and girls. Sorry, did I hear a comment there? No, okay. So what is this exploitation about? A lot of it to do with the use of very cheap labor, but also of very nimble hands and children. Child slaves make shoes and carpets. They work in the garment and industrial sweatshops across the Far East and Middle East. Slaves, including children, mine gold and other ores needed for modern technology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Sugar is harvested by slaves in parts of the Caribbean. Slaves make toys for the worldwide market, and they make clothes for every nation under the sun. Slaves are often involved in brick making. They make some of the factories that provide us with high-tech goods. Slave labor is behind them. And some of them make the charcoal that tempers steel for our cars and for industrial processes. Pension funds often own stock in companies using slave labor. And there's a real question here about the supply chain in most industries. There are very few industries out there that can actually say, hand on heart, our supply chain is completely free from slave labor. So various efforts have been made to do that. And that's an ongoing process across the anti-slavery movement.
Michael, you're muted again.
Thank you. I keep hitting the space button to move on the slides. That's why. My apologies. This has come to the notice of the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are agreed by all the UN member states, are 17 in all, and they're an urgent call for action by the world, all of the whole world, to engage in a global partnership to end poverty and other deprivations and tackling the really big problems in our time. Sustainable Development Goal number 8 says to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. And that's broken down into sections, and section 7 says to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, to end modern slavery and human trafficking, secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labour, including recruitment and the use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labour in all its forms. And there's efforts ongoing to see can that actually be done. I said at the beginning that this is a rather chilling thing to be talking about when you see the horrible reality that lies behind it. And the next slide I'm going to show you is an extract from the work of Kevin Bales, his book called Blood and Earth. And he says, he talks about cell phones have become electronic umbilical cords. But there's all sorts of ways we connect with people. There's food, rings we exchange, and we tend to understand those things from the point they arrive in our lives. Like, I bought an engagement ring when I got engaged. I buy a telephone when I need one and have it for a few years. I buy food every week. And I rarely think about where these things have come from and what's gone into the construction. Where did the gold come from in that engagement ring? Where did the diamond come from in it? What about the rare earth minerals in my phone? Where did they come from? And Kevin Bales goes on to say, we think of Steve Jobs in his black turtleneck sweater as the origin of our iPhones. And he says, we think about gravestones, particularly red granite is commonly used in the United States. That's kind of what we see in a cemetery. But where these things have actually come from, and very often the slave labor involved in some part of the process that have generated those things. When we buy a shrimp cocktail or grilled shrimp on a barbecue, that's quite possible that shrimp has in fact come by slave labor. And I'm going to talk about the shrimping industry as well later on. But there are stories behind all the things that we purchase, whether they're electronics or clothes or the food we eat, that can very often have a sordid tale behind them. And part of what we're trying to do in anti-human trafficking is to stop that part of the tale and make sure that things are going to be different. So where do we see human trafficking? One example here is in car washes. And this is both in Ireland and in England. We know this is a feature. If you've ever driven into a car wash, there's a whole pile of men usually doing the work. None of them speak English. You've no idea of knowing whether they are actually freely doing this or whether they have had their passports taken from them. I was talking to one researcher from Tusla during the week, and she was telling me back in 2007, there was a car wash on one of the main roads in Limerick, and she was driving by one day to a case with a Romanian interpreter. And the Romanian interpreter told her that those men were Romanians and that they were afraid to come forward because they were undocumented. And she went on to explain she had never heard the word undocumented before. So the Romanian interpreter told her that these men had their passports had been taken from them. They would not go to the police. They wanted the work. They needed the money, and they were in fact captives. That's a form of modern slavery, because there's no guarantee they're going to get paid at the end of it. There's no guarantee that they're freely doing this. So there's a relationship there at times between people who have been smuggled, say, for labour, and who end up being trafficked for exploitation. Nail bars is another one. Particularly, we've seen young Asian women, very often Vietnamese, who have been coerced into doing this kind of work. You'll remember that horrific case in Essex last year, where those people died in that container. Most of them were Vietnamese, and some of them were Vietnamese women coming for this kind of work. Cannabis grow houses, of course, is another. We've had several cases in Ireland where police have broken into grow houses and found inside a person who's been switching on and off the lights to make the flowers grow. And those people claim to have been trafficked. And I know there's one very infamous case in Ireland. It's known as the P case because it went to the High Court. The P case, the young woman has been in prison for at least 2.5 years, despite the fact that she was well able to document that she was in fact a victim of human trafficking, and yet she was prosecuted with the crime of being in charge of a grow house. So there's a real tension there, what can happen to people who are exploited for criminal purposes or forced to engage in criminality to make profits for their exploiters. Sexual exploitation, of course, is a very significant one. This particular photograph is from Thailand. There is a very sad situation in Thailand where you have in parts of the southern highlands, you have families who will sell a daughter, never a son, mind you, but they will sell a daughter to work in the restaurant industry. It's the kind of words that are put around it, for the price of a colour television. And of course, the use of brothels with young women in them seems to be much more acceptable in certain parts of the world, but there's a lot of work has gone on to begin to stop this happening, and a lot of good work is happening on the ground. So I think we're beginning to see some changes there. This is the fishing industry. Small boy engaged in gutting fish, small fingers, nimble hands, able to gut and shell out the fish. This is particularly a problem in Thailand, and I'll illustrate this later on with a piece of a quote from Kara Siddharth as to what happens to the kids on the fishing boats. But he doesn't look particularly like he's enjoying his work. But we're talking about very young children. This is a sweatshop in India, where you've small children who, instead of being at school, are engaged in this kind of work, and whose childhood is swallowed up in being exploited for profit. This is from the Middle East, and you have very small children who are able to have the dexterity in their fingers to make the very, very small knots that the carpets require for quality. The more knots per square inch, the more expensive the carpet's going to be, and it takes children with fingers, tiny fingers, to be able to make those knots with great dexterity. Again, these children's lives are being swallowed up in this kind of labour rather than in anything else. And finally, this is a brickyard where cheap bricks are being made. And again, this child is able to go along because he's small enough he can balance on the bricks. And this is day in and day out. Human trafficking is a vile and evil trade. Absolutely vile and utterly evil. And dealing with the material is often deeply upsetting. This was one piece I came across when I was doing my own research, and I was really upset by it. But I think it's important that these truths are known. So that Cara talked about interviewing a Colonel Chindanovich, who is the chief of the anti-trafficking police in Thailand. And Chindanovich told him, he said, it's great, he said, we've been set up as a unit, I have about 20 men under my control, I have absolutely no vehicles, I have no budget, and I have no computing power. But we're trying to get the work done. And he then went on to describe the most atrocious form of trafficking that he was dealing with. And he said the trafficking for forced labor and fishing is the most violent. And he talked about Cambodian boys being essentially kidnapped and forced to go to sea, where they stay on the ships doing the shrimping or whatever, because again, small hands, they can shell those shrimp and gut them very quickly, and other boats come and take those fish off. But at the end of the interview, Kara asked Chindanovich, what happens to the boys? And he said, many of them were shot and thrown into the sea. That they were simply human garbage to be disposed of because they were going to take off from the profit margin if they were allowed to live and they had to be fed or whatever on the boats. And that's the awful reality here. These lives are regarded as being of no account by the people who are engaged in exploitation. This is really a scar on the face of humanity. Amy and I were discussing this yesterday, and we recognize that slavery has been there since the dawn of time, but it's time to put a stop to it. The Santa Marta Group is an initiative of Pope Francis, and it's an alliance of the church, law enforcement and civil society, which works to eradicate human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And the Pope's description of trafficking is as an open wound on the body of contemporary society. And it's a gaping wound. I mean, 40 million people who are subjected to this. And the group meet and work throughout between meetings on information sharing and strategies to combat trafficking, which continue to raise global awareness of the problems and provide solutions on the ground. For example, there is one initiative going on in Nigeria at the moment where young women were being recruited for sexual exploitation. So the Santa Marta Group in Nigeria has trained a group of village women who have responded very well to this. And they go out now to other villages and they talk to the mothers about what a sexual exploitation approach will look like and the promises that are made and what nonsense they actually are. And that's beginning to have an effect in slowing down the supply of slaves from that particular source. When Cardinal Vincent Nichols, who is the president of the Santa Marta Group, launched the HTEPI report last week, he told a story that I hadn't heard before. And he said at the first Santa Marta meeting in Rome, the Holy Father, when they gathered for the group photographs, kind of nudged him in the ribs and said, this meeting is far more important than most I attend. Please make sure it keeps going. And it is going and continues to do powerful work at all sorts of different levels. The objectives of Santa Marta are to increase awareness, to build trusting relationships, to foster collaboration for public policy and legislation, law enforcement, and improve pastoral care for victims. Above all else, it puts the care of victims at the centre of the law enforcement approaches to human trafficking. And that's really critical, that this isn't simply a matter about crime. It's a matter about people who are being deeply hurt and traumatized by what's happening to them. And the group share experiences and best practices amongst the members. And because that happens, then you get a better outturn in the various countries where Santa Marta is actually working. And that's in most of the countries in the world now. So they try to provide tailored solutions, working on collaboration between neighbours, driving education and economic opportunities on the supply side, and on the demand side, strong legal framework, accountability and active citizenship. They recognise the need for local action. They see a huge role for the private sector, and they see the importance of transparency in supply chains. And there are so many different elements to this that where the supply chain issue is important. The mobile phone one is a case in point. All of our mobile phones have cobalt in them, and about 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A at least 20% of the mines in the Congo are driven by casual labor. And that casual labor is often a small child who goes down into a slit trench with a bag, a sack, and brings up a sack of ore that's then mined. It's the cheapest way to get the ore out of the ground. So the hole the child goes into can be very deep. The reality is that if the hole collapses, it's cheaper to buy a new child than it is to excavate that hole to rescue him or her. And that's the reality of where some of the rare earth minerals that are going into our electronics are actually coming from. And it's how things that we use and take for granted every day are really tainted. I mean, what Colonel Chindanovich described there is about the shrimping. That's the shrimp supply for the Western world, but so much of that actually comes from Thailand. And you don't think about it when you sit down to eat, that it could be that the food I'm eating here, that somebody has been exploited, or worse, somebody has been killed to supply me with this, or to allow me make this phone call or use my laptop. But that's the reality of human trafficking. So Santa Marta, in practice, was Victims at the Centre. It aims to impact policy and practice worldwide. It argues, as Pope Francis puts it so eloquently, that love and care have no boundaries. And as long as this evil exists, it is our task to confront it. And it provides for its victims care, dignity, hope, and safety. And it works to bring an end to this evil. And it's extraordinary to talk to the victims who have come to the notice and been rescued by some of the work of Santa Marta. And they emphasize that middle line there, that their experience, the love and care from Santa Marta has been remarkable, and that it has saved so many lives. How did Santa Marta come to Mary Immaculate College? One of the founding members of Santa Marta, a man who had the idea, was Bishop Patrick Lynch. Bishop Lynch is an Irishman. He's a Sacred Heart priest who became an auxiliary bishop in Southwark Diocese in London. And Father Michael Hayes, our late president of the college, was a priest of Southwark Diocese and knew Patrick Lynch. And when Michael came to Mary I, he saw an opening here that could ally the skill sets he knew were in the college with the possibility of doing something in Santa Marta, which he saw in the way that Santa Marta sees it as that real scar on the face of humanity. So he made that connection between ourselves and Santa Marta, and ourselves and the police force in Ireland, and it grew from there to what it is now. Santa Marta, of course, or the Santa Marta project in Mary I, the HTEPI project, Human Trafficking and Exploitation in the island of Ireland, was one that was funded by the college, but also by the police force in Northern Ireland, by the Garda Síochána via the European Fund, by the Department of Justice in Ireland and the Department of Justice in Northern Ireland. And so you have a real work of policy there, of intensive research, but with the policymakers and the law arm of the law who are going to put that into action and begin to do something about it. So Santa Marta has a biannual meeting in Rome every 2 years. And Michael Healy and I went there and met with Santa Marta, and part of our privilege there was to meet with the Holy Father and to hear his address on this topic. And so that meeting and slightly before it, HTEPI was proposed, defined, developed, and delivered. And the delivery of that took place last month when we launched the HTEPI report, which has remarkable implications because of the recommendations it has for how things are going to change in Ireland. And in fact, one of the big issues around trafficking in Ireland is what's called the identification process, which I think Amy will say a little more about. But I know that last week, the new national referral mechanism, which we made recommendations in the report, as recently as that new mechanism went to Cabinet and has been approved. So already you're seeing the kind of recommendations that we made in that report beginning to have a really strategic and effective impact. And at that stage, I'm going to stop talking. I think I'm going to stop. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Amy. So I'll stop sharing my screen and see where we go from there.
Thank you, Michael.
If I figure out how to do this, of course, this is the problem. There we go.
Okay, I did control.
Did this go? Did my screen disappear?
I'll see if I can share mine. If not, you'll have to.
Your screen has gone.
Sorry, my screen is gone, is it?
Your screen has gone, yeah, and we're getting a bit of interference. So maybe, Michael, if you turned your microphone off, maybe it would be better when Amy speaks. Thanks so much. That was brilliant.
Can people see this?
Yes.
So you can see the screen, you can see the slides, yes?
We can see the slides, yes.
Okay, I will skip to mine. Well, thank you for that, Michael. I've been asked to talk through the research project. So for those of you who were at the launch a few weeks ago, it'll be similar to what I said then, and then I will pass it back to Michael to talk about our recommendations, which he just referred to there previously. So the point of the Human Trafficking and Exploitation project was to provide the best data possible as to the scale, scope, extent, and nature of human trafficking and exploitation on the island of Ireland. Now, Michael's already told you who the funders were, and as you can see, many of those organizations obviously have what you would think is the most information on human trafficking on the island of Ireland. At least that's what I thought when I interviewed for the job. I was trying to figure out why they wanted a sociologist or a researcher for this post. But ultimately, the whole point of this project was to find out who's missing. So we were trying to find who's not working with the guards or with the PSNI. But before we get into that, it's important for us all to know what it means to be a victim of trafficking. Now, there's slightly different legislation to the north to the Republic of Ireland. So it was agreed by the Executive Board, which included An Garda Síochána, the PSNI, both departments of justice, plus an academic group that works on associated issues, that we would use the Palermo Protocol, which is the international definition of trafficking. And it's important that we all realize that there's three parts to defining someone as a trafficking victim, because oftentimes trafficking is conflated with other things. Now, there needs to be an act. So somebody may be transported. I think we often think of transportation when we think of trafficking, but somebody doesn't necessarily have to be transported. I also think that's part of the reason we often get trafficking mixed up with smuggling. They're different. Smuggling is considered a crime against the state because a person's trying to get into a country illegally. So the person who's being smuggled has in some ways initiated the act, where trafficking is considered to be a crime against a person because they are taken, they are transported, oftentimes either against their will or through deceit, but I'll get onto that in a minute. So the act can be transportation, recruitment, transferring, harboring, or receipt of persons. So that's the first part. But there also needs to be means associated with that act. So it can be a threat of force or a use of force or coercion. It can be abduction. I mean, that is one way we often think of someone being trafficked, that somebody's actually just picked up on the street and thrown into a van and taken somewhere. It doesn't usually happen that way. It can happen. There were a number of people who were abducted who were brought into Ireland, but not many. It's usually by deception, actually, that people have ended up coming into Ireland and then become trafficked. But it can be fraud, abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability, giving or receivement of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And even if someone, an adult, agrees to come over to Ireland, if any of these means were used, then consent is irrelevant. So even if they said they do it, but they were told a lie, or they were coerced, threatened, or forced, then their consent is irrelevant. And then finally, the purpose can be associated with a variety of types of exploitation. Prostitution is often conflated with trafficking, but obviously sexual exploitation is a purpose, but it would need to be tied to those other things. So there would need to be some kind of transfer or transport, then either deception, force, or abuse. So as you can see, there needs to be an act, a means, and then sexual exploitation or forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or, I mean, I never saw a case of removal of organs in Ireland, but that's a possibility as well. Within forced labor, it can be forced labor for criminal exploitation as well. Michael alluded to that with grow houses. Sometimes people think of sham marriages as being trafficking, but that's not considered to be trafficking in either Northern Ireland or the Republic. So who's considered to be a trafficking victim in our statistics in both countries? Well, in order for someone to be considered a trafficking victim now, they would need to meet the definition of being trafficked. So there would need to be an aim, a means, and a purpose, and there would need to be proof of all those things. And within the Republic of Ireland, someone would need to be recognized as a trafficking victim by An Garda Síochána and agree to go into the National Referral Mechanism. Michael referred to that briefly. The National Referral Mechanism is just the suite of services that are provided to trafficking victims. So housing, medical care, counseling, legal advice. Sadly, within the Republic of Ireland, the only housing that is available for trafficking victims, if they don't have a right to be here, is direct provision, so they will be put in with asylum seekers. If someone's trafficked and they're Irish, they're referred to a homeless shelter. Within Northern Ireland, for someone to be considered a trafficking victim, they have to be recognized as such by the PSNI or the Home Office or other statutory agencies like the Border Patrol, Border Police, and they also need to agree to go into the National Referral Mechanism. For the time period of this study, these are the statistics that have been published by both countries. So the period of time that I was looking at was January 2013 to September 2019 for both countries. As you can see, there's slightly more recognized victims of trafficking in the Republic of Ireland than there are in the North. But if you consider the difference in populations, Northern Ireland is a bit more successful in finding victims of trafficking. As you can also see, there's far more females than males in the Republic of Ireland, about 2 to 1. In the North, it's a bit even, it's more even. Michael referred to the statistic that about 70% of trafficking victims are women. Part of this, though, in the Republic of Ireland is there's very much a focus on sexual exploitation for trafficking. And in the North, there's probably a bit more balance between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. As you can also see, though, there's very few minors who have been classified as trafficking victims in Ireland. A few years ago, the way a child was designated as a trafficking victim in Ireland was changed, and I should have the statistic, but I don't. I think about 60 or 70 children who had been classified as trafficking victims were no longer classified as such because they were exploited by an Irish person who they knew. So it was deemed as not being classified as trafficking. So who's missing our research methods? That's screen. Sorry, that didn't show up very well. Apologies about that. So that doesn't look good at all. This was a multi-stage mixed methods research project. And what it should show you on one side of the arrows is that initially it was a qualitative project. It was exploratory. We needed to find out if there was data telling us about people outside of the system and if organizations would be willing to share it. Once we found out that information was available, then it became a mixed methods project. We collected data from participating organizations via Qualtrics, via survey, and I also interviewed participating organizations a number of times. So the quantitative was to give us information, anonymous information about victims of trafficking, gender, nationality, their route, how they got to Ireland, what they did, and various means that were used to exploit them. The qualitative information was used to explain why they weren't in the system with the other victims of trafficking. You know, why were they not engaging with the guards or the PSNI? So how to find this? I suppose a key with the executive board is that the participating organizations, we decided to work with organizations that work with trafficking victims as opposed to victims of trafficking. For one thing, the main aim of this was to find out numbers of who's missing. It was a quantitative project, so it was felt that those organizations that work with trafficking victims would have a better sense of numbers. But also in terms of talking about the whole process, it was felt that talking to trafficking victims in this way might further traumatize them. So it was agreed that we would talk to organizations in the North. They have a trafficking engagement group, so all the organizations, the NGOs, statutory, non-statutory, who work with trafficking victims, they asked that group who would be willing to work with us. I was given names and emails and spoke with those organizations. We did some snowball sampling from that, and ultimately 7 organizations agreed to participate. Within the Republic of Ireland, I had to do a bit of detective work, so I had to look through Department of Justice and Equality publications to see which organizations were mentioned. I contacted those organizations, found someone who would talk to me, and also did some snowball sampling from there. So 11 organizations agreed to participate. And I suppose what was important for the executive board is that the people, the organizations that participated would know how to identify a trafficking victim. They would need to know that they had to be all three criteria, because as I said, trafficking is often conflated with smuggling, with prostitution, and it's more than that. So who's missing? Obviously, the victims of trafficking who never come to the attention of the guards or the PSNI, and this can be deliberate or not deliberate, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail. There's also victims of trafficking who are known to the guards and the police, but will not self-identify as a victim of trafficking. I'll talk a bit more about that too. Within Ireland, within the Republic, not the North, in order for a victim of trafficking to be put into the national referral mechanism, they also have to cooperate with the guards in a criminal investigation against their trafficker. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but there are quite a few victims of trafficking who would be too afraid to do that and therefore never actually get put into the system. So who won't talk to the guards and the PSNI? Well, there are many victims of trafficking who are just too afraid to testify against their trafficker, and that crosses all nationalities. I've put in African women who are under juju or the oath, so that's witchcraft. They've been threatened or abused with death to themselves, illness, to their families. So they're just terrified of what could happen. There are also groups of women who have been groomed since they were very young to be exploited, and they're very attached to their traffickers. So they will deny they're being trafficked. But then there's also those who just don't want to be sent back to their countries. So they'll deny that they're being trafficked because they're terrified. They're actually terrified to come forward. They just don't want to return. We discovered that the LGBTQ community is very much afraid of being sent, oftentimes because they are under threat of death if they return to their countries. There's also those who are trafficked who are just very vulnerable and have no real understanding of what's happening to them or why they are where they are, but they don't understand that they've been trafficked. Within certain cultures, it's not acceptable to talk about sex or abuse. So a woman may talk to a male guard and not mention what happened to her because it's inappropriate. There were examples of women who worked with interpreters who were of different genders or different class. And again, they wouldn't speak to them because it was inappropriate to talk about the abuse or about sex. Only later then, when they were introduced to a guard or an interpreter of a similar class or gender, they then talked about their exploitation, and their story was not deemed credible because it had changed over time. So from our study, I don't know how I'm doing on time, so hopefully okay. As you can see, we did find additional victims in both countries. The difference between probable and possible was probable. Someone was definitely identified as a trafficking victim by a participating organization, and they were able to show all three: the aims, the means, and the purpose. With possible victims, it's a bit, there wasn't as much data. I think you have to think the person was definitely identified as a trafficking victim, but I don't have as much support. We were basically relying on people's memories, or sometimes people had some data that they could share, but basically what we were looking to find was that someone was designated as trafficking really in the mind of the organization or those working, but didn't actually go into the system. So a lot of people didn't record this as such. So it was a bit tricky, but I'm confident that the ones that we found were designated appropriately. So as you can see, in Ireland, we found about, I suppose, 130 more victims of trafficking. In Northern Ireland, over 50, and I'm quite sure this isn't all the victims of trafficking in either country that are still outside of the system, but these are the ones that we found out about. So who's still missing? Victims of trafficking are often referred to as being invisible in plain sight. They're everywhere. There's some, though, who may want to hide. So people who've been trafficked for criminal exploitation. If someone's been smuggled in, they may have no real hope of getting a job in Ireland unless they work with a trafficker. They would be very reticent to come forward to the guards because they know that they will probably be deported, even if they've been trafficked, even if they've been exploited, simply because they're not supposed to be here. Similarly, those who have been trafficked for criminal activity, as Michael said, if you're here and you're found to do something against the law, it's much easier to prosecute you for that than it is to prove that you were trafficked. So oftentimes those who are trafficked for criminal exploitation end up in prison. Victims of trafficking are usually desperate, often desperate for work, for any money at all. They may not have a place to live or any resources where they're coming from. So even a horrible place to live without much money, with limited food, is better than where they've come from. So they're just desperate to keep working. And Michael already went through some of the sectors, but to be honest, trafficking victims can be anywhere that people work, anywhere. These are just areas that are more likely. Generally, you know, if you think about jobs that don't take a huge amount of skill, that don't require English, because that's often a problem. Victims of trafficking lack language skills. There's also people who have been trafficked but blame themselves. So women who agreed to come over for sex work or prostitution, but then find in reality it's a bad situation. They're exploited. They're made to do things they don't want to do. They're not allowed to use protection, and they end up not, you know, they don't get the money that they were supposed to earn. So they end up in what the guards call forced prostitution. But having said that, oftentimes, since they've consented to come here, they would not be classified as a trafficking victim. There are groups who actually meet the criteria of trafficking victim but aren't classified as such in either country. Minors who are recruited by criminal gangs would be one of those groups. There's research going on at the University of Limerick now that has indicated there's 1,000 children in the Republic of Ireland alone who have been recruited by criminal gangs. And since we don't need a means, they simply need to be recruited and exploited for a minor to be considered a trafficking victim. They do classify for us, but not in terms of our legislators. And obviously, there's still loads of people out there who did not seek help from the organizations that we worked with. But then there's also the organizations that participated with us. There's just data they didn't give us. Some organizations told us that they had information, but it was their clients' information and they wouldn't share it with us. So even though we asked for anonymous data, the organizations felt quite strongly that they needed to be supportive of their clients. So I do know there's more data out there that we didn't have access to, but I suppose this does give us some sense that there are obviously victims of trafficking outside of the system who aren't getting help. So Michael, can I turn it back to you and you can discuss the recommendations?
Michael, have you got your microphone on? We can't hear anything. Thank you so much, Amy. That was super. Absolutely super.
Oh, no, not at all. Thanks, Trish. Michael, are you there, or do you want me to talk through this?
I think he has his microphone off. It's coming up as being off on screen.
Well, I can keep talking. So we came up with really 5 recommendations that we presented as part of our report. And certainly right now there is no there's no detailed protocol within the Republic of Ireland on how somebody is designated as a victim of trafficking. It's really a person walks into or comes in contact with the Gardaí, and it's very much up to the Gardaí at the desk to be able to recognize someone as a victim of trafficking. So I think we need a clearer and detailed eligibility protocol for entry into the NRM. We'd also hope that the authority to refer a victim of trafficking into services be expanded. As you could see from my presentation, a lot of people are just afraid to work with the guards or the authority system. And Greta, which is an international organization that goes around and looks at official systems of working with trafficking victims, has often recommended that Ireland allow the NGOs that work with trafficking victims to designate someone as a victim of trafficking and put them straight into care and help, so that those people can start getting services and deal with trauma before, because it can take months. I was talking to with people who work in women's centers with domestic abuse and trafficking victims, and it can take months before a woman's willing to talk. But it's important that woman get help anyway. So, if the authority to refer a victim into services expanded, a victim can start getting help, start trusting people, and then may be willing to work with the police. Because as it stands now, the Republic of Ireland has never convicted anyone of trafficking, if you can imagine. Nobody, no trafficker. With all those numbers, all the 350 that they've counted themselves and the extra 130, nobody's ever been convicted for those crimes. We've suggested that there be an inclusive all-island database so that there can be clearer communication between the North and the Republic and a better sense, because some of the work I did, I could compare a bit, and obviously it's quite easy for people to cross the border. So it's important for us to know at both sides of the border who's being moved back and forth. And certainly when I talk to organizations that work with sex workers and prostitutes, people are just moved. They're moved across the whole island of Ireland. Their national borders mean nothing. What we also found, though, is a lot of people who come in contact with trafficking victims don't know how to identify them. So there really needs to be more trafficking training. We all need to be aware of the indicators. If you go to a car wash, if you go to a nail bar and people don't speak English, if they're not wearing protective gear, if it's really too cheap, somebody's paying for that, and it's definitely the victim who's waiting on you, And as I said, for them, it might be better than being at home and being homeless or not having anything. So, I mean, they may deny that, but I mean, it's not fair. Everyone needs to be treated fairly and to have decent working conditions. And that, so hopefully Ireland will think about a widespread public communication and information campaign. So I think that's it for me. If you're interested in the report, it's up on Mir now, and I can't see anyone, so I'm going to hit escape, and I'm going to try to click